I get to play the role of interviewer, and this is a great thing for me because I'm a big fan and have been so helped by Catherine's work and your friendship and all. So thank you for sharing your time with us today.
Likewise, I'm so grateful for your fellowship and friendship and for all of you.
Great. Katherine, you are an expert on something called Christian nationalism. People in the room might be familiar with it. We have it on the side of our bus, Confronting Christian Nationalism. We run trainings that involve some of your teachings around the country. We ask people, how many of you are opposed to Christian nationalism? And all the hands in the rooms go up, partly because they're coming to a Confronting Christian Nationalism event. And then we'll say, how many of you can define Christian nationalism? And about 90% of the hands go down. They know they're not for it, but people have a hard time knowing exactly what it is to a satisfying level. Do you experience that? And if so, when people ask you, what do people mean by Christian nationalism? How do you respond?
Well, how I respond is this. Christian nationalism, let's talk about what it is, and let's talk about what it's not. Christian nationalism is not Christianity, religion. It is a political movement and ideology that exploits religion to consolidate political power. So when I think about it, I think about it as two different things. On the one hand, it's an ideology, a set of ideas, and on the other hand, it's an organized movement to consolidate political power. So let's talk about what each of those things mean. As an ideology, Christian nationalism boils down to the idea that America is founded as a so-called Christian nation, which is really a very sort of reactionary understanding of what the Christian religion is. And it says that this is what makes us great. It's a very identitarian. It's got all these ideology. It has all these cultural assumptions attached to it. And it says that this is what makes us great, rather than our democracy, our democratic principles, the principles of equality and pluralism and justice that represent the best of the American promise. And it sort of says that all of our problems derive from the fact that we have somehow abandoned these principles that are supposedly our country is supposedly founded upon. But that ideology is really just a tool for a leadership-driven political machine that turns that story into a tool for political power. I mean, the movement, as I mentioned earlier, is both leadership-driven and it's also organization-driven. So I want to talk about what that looks like and how it works for a minute.
I've been an evangelical pastor for my entire adult life.
Right.
I'm in the progressive evangelical stream, which is small and very unknown to a lot of people. But I know that in the larger evangelical traditions, and even in the Catholic traditions and many of the mainline traditions, people feel like, I wish there was more spirituality or more God in our society. That's like an impulse people have. They talk about it a lot. That's not what you're saying is Christian nationalism.
No, absolutely.
People are exploiting that. It seems like that's what
right. It's the exploitation of religion. It's very identitarian. I would say it sort of promotes ideas that most American Christians would see as antithetical to their understanding of the religion. But it's not just a set of attitudes embraced by the rank and file. It's really a political pathology that afflicts political systems. And it's also a kind of, it's also a tool for political power. And the way that it works is by sort of exploiting that story of America's allegedly conservative Christian founding and all of those cultural assumptions, and sort of using that to litigate, a really broad-based political and economic agenda. And a lot of the way that works is that the movement has invested for decades in a range of organizations, and we can sort of group them into categories. So there are policy groups, and I'm going to name some names. This is by no means comprehensive. Policy groups like the American Family Association or the Family Research Council. There are think tanks such as Heritage and its activist arm, or the Manhattan Institute. There's a very vast and very well-funded legal advocacy sphere, groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom, which has an annual operating budget of over $100 million a year. Groups like the Federalist Society, which play an outsized role in sort of grooming and promoting candidates for the courts with the right, sort of correct ideological bona fides. Groups like Liberty Counsel, the Pacific Justice Institute. There are very sophisticated data operations, networking organizations, such as the Council for National Policy, Family, or groups like the Ziklag group. A lot of these groups bring together movement leaders, bring them together with big donors to the movement, and also sometimes politicians who are favorable to the movement. They are not always, yeah.
So I have two questions for you.
Sure.
And I'm going to clump them together and you pick which one you want to answer
Sure.
In whatever order. One is, why do you know all this? And why was that interesting to you to figure it out? Because you spent some time understanding this. Why do you know it? And the second is, do these groups self-identify as Christian nationalists?
That's a great question, Doug, because you can't say that every single person who works for all of these groups is a, quote, a Christian nationalist, right? But what you can say is that these organizations are contributing to a Christian nationalist agenda or a religious nationalist agenda. Because again, religious nationalism, like authoritarianism, is a political pathology that afflicts political systems. It's not just a set of attitudes embraced, it's not like something that's embraced by millions of supporters. The one thing I want to say about the movement, it is radically anti-democratic, both in its ideology and also in its methods of operation. This is a movement that rejects the principles of pluralism, equality, and justice that represent the best of the American promise. It's a movement that promotes this idea that there are certain kinds of Americans destined to rule and other Americans who should be compelled to submit. It's very identitarian. It's really kind of an identitarian nationalism. It's an idea of, the insider versus the outsider, the pure versus the impure, those who are the true Americans, and then the others who are worthy of contempt or having their rights stripped from them.
Hearing you say that reminds me of that video that I saw when the people participated in what I consider was an insurrection on January 6, 2021. They were inside the Senate dais and they led a prayer after taking over that space and said, "Thank you, God, for letting us in," and to show that this is our country and not theirs. That kind of mentality and that kind of thought. Is that consistent in the world of Christian nationalism? People talking about taking our country back, or it's ours and not their country?
Exactly. Sometimes it's easier to see when it's happening in other countries. When we look at political leaders like Orban in Hungary, or Erdogan in Turkey, or perhaps leaders in Iran, or to some degree, some of what Modi is doing in India, when these leaders bind themselves tightly to ultra-conservative religious figures in order to consolidate their own political power, we recognize this rightly as religious nationalism. Why do they do it? They are, I think about someone like Putin in Russia. They're doing it to consolidate their grip on their country by dividing their own country. They are using it to almost bubble wrap themselves in sanctimony, so that inhibits any check on their corruption, their cronyism, or perhaps nepotism or abuses they may be perpetrating against their own people. And we have, listen, this is a nonpartisan event, so I'm not going to name any individual politicians or parties, but we have seen some candidates for president in this election cycle do this kind of thing. They say, well, The greatest threat is not to our foreign enemies, as dangerous as they may be. The greatest threat to our country is the enemy within. Yeah. And that's a way of dividing between the righteous and the unrighteous.
That can be tempting for people on all sides of the political spectrum to think that the others need to be removed from power. I think that it's fair to say the current Speaker of the House at the federal level is a self-identified Christian nationalist. Mm-hmm. I think he identifies that way. And there's a lot of people I know who vote the way I do and think the way I do, who feel like no one who holds his views should ever have political power in America. How does that kind of thing strike you?
Listen, we're all free to engage in the political level and advocate for and vote for the candidates that we prefer. But the thing about religious nationalism is that this religious nationalist leaders, they go after the press, they go after the electoral system, voting rights, they go after women's rights and rights of sexual minorities and religious minorities and anyone who's deemed an other. And this is antithetical to our democratic principles. Listen, voting rights are the foundation. That's like a foundation of our democracy. It's the right to vote, the right to have our policies deliberated in public, and our laws sort of affirmed through democratic processes. And so trying to, deny the consequences of a legitimately decided election is something that we should all be deeply concerned about. I know. To get back to a question you asked, like, why do I know this? So I've been researching and writing about this movement for 15 years, and a lot of the way that I do my research is I go to events, I go to strategy meetings and gatherings and conferences. I want to tell you about one that I attended. I went to an event put on by an organization called Faith Wins. It's one of the many pastoral organizations like Watchmen on the Wall, Church United. What these organizations do is get conservative-leaning pastors together, and they, often bring them together in, a church setting, and they get people from the local area, and then they do these presentations that are like, you need to get your people out to vote. These are the biblical issues, and those biblical issues, supposedly biblical issues, inevitably reduced to 2 or 3 of the, favored culture war issues. It's not about alleviating poverty, of course, or, promoting justice or equality. It's always about, reproductive rights, same-sex marriage, and things like that. And so I went to this gathering, and people putting on this event included Chad Connolly, a member of the Council for National Policy and a deep, longtime Republican operative, David Barton, who's one of the movement's sort of key myth makers. And then they had with them this guy named Hogan Gidley, who was a former member of the Trump administration, and he was there to spread election lies. This is 2021. It was a few weeks after this Republican-led examination of the legitimacy of the vote in, I believe it was Arizona. Do you remember the cyber ninjas? They call themselves the cyber ninjas. And he said, you all saw it. And by the way, this group of Republican-led operatives were looking very closely, very carefully for evidence of election fraud, and they didn't find any. They couldn't, and they were like, they were so sad about that, but they were like, I'm sorry, we came up with nothing. But here's Hogan Gidley saying, well, you all saw it happen in Arizona and how corrupt that was. So even though this had been completely debunked by a Republican-led group, he's there to spread lies about it and suggest that there was something nefarious. Dead people are voting, and this is disgraceful. And there was a pastor there, I think his name was Brian Fox. He said the church is not a cruise ship. The church is a battleship. So the main message there is to, you've got to get your people out to vote, and you've got to get them to vote the right way for the hard right politicians who are going to enact our agenda. Now, there's something really ironic about this, because this is a movement that claims to stand for family values. They get people to vote on these culture war issues by claiming to stand for the American family, but they're driving support for politicians whose hard right economic policies are actually intensifying economic pressure on the American family. When you think about people who are funding the movement, it's always follow the money. A lot of the big funders of the movement are as dedicated, if not more dedicated, to right-wing economic positions as they are to positions in the so-called culture wars. So, for instance, the DeVos Prince family juggernaut, they're huge donors to organizations, religious right organizations and think tanks. They're also promoting initiatives intended to break unions and to erode rights for the workforce. These are policies that are actually going to help American families. So even as they're claiming to stand for American families, they're pushing policies that are making it so much harder for American families to succeed.
So you approach this as a journalist. You've written a book, which is up on the screen, Power Worshippers, and you're in the midst of soon going to be releasing another book about all of this. It's easy for a lot of us to speak about this at the national level, and there's a sense in which you can name these big organizations spending $100 million in sophisticated backroom kinds of operations that influence pastor networks, and it's very, Da Vinci Code level of freak out for people. It's also happening, and maybe even as impactfully, at a local level. Can you talk about what Christian nationalism looks like at the local level and why school boards and county commissions are all of a sudden like we're being inundated with a takeover where people are making arguments that feel like, I don't know what America I'm living in, and it's striking those local governments at a different level. And you can talk about how the plan is to organize to implement these policies at local levels.
Here we are in North Carolina. It's kind of ground zero for all of this stuff, isn't it? This is really, by rights, a purple state. But thanks to race-based gerrymandering, and so this is really, it's a state with a really hard right governance. And so it's very difficult to promote policies that are supported by a majority of the population or a plurality of the public population. All politics, look, we all notice some of these things when they show up in national elections. We see people on CNN or whatever news channel we're watching, and we see some of this stuff, and it's glaring. We saw it on January 6th. But sometimes it's harder to notice when it's showing up at the local level. When you have, all of a sudden, your local school board is taken over by people talking about some book banning, and we need to ban books and this kind of stuff. You just think, well, this must be a local initiative driven by local personalities. And often, it's really not. Some of these groups are part of, I think about Moms for Liberty. We're all aware of that whole story. But it's a national organization with local chapters, and they're taking a lot of their direction from the national leaders. But when we cede ground at the local level to activists, we're abandoning our responsibility to our communities, to our children, and they are the religious right, Christian nationalist movement is very good at activating people at the local level by with these national initiatives. A lot of them go through Leadership Institute training. They give them a lot of support. So it's really important to step up and be a voice for your own community.
So there's a lot going on at the national level and at the local level with people trying to activate Christian nationalism agenda.
Absolutely.
Michael Flynn is big into this kind of stuff. Steve Bannon, his radio show, it is alive and well in a whole subset of culture. And people know what to do if they want to put Christian nationalist agendas, regardless if they use that term to identify. They know how to act. Those of us that want to resist, confront, present an alternative to Christian nationalism, what can we all do? And I will invite people to take a minute and just take a breath and sort of reset their minds a little bit to take in, okay, we're not hopeless, and there are things that people can do. What are those?
Well, first of all, we need to remember that those of us who reject the politics of conquest and division are in the majority in this country. Religious and non-religious alike, we are the majority, and we need to organize. This is a movement that represents a minority of the population. They only have the political power they do because they're disproportionately mobilized. So we all need to get mobilized too, and there are no shortage of avenues for engagement at the local level, at the state level, and frankly at the national level too. I mean, everybody's going to sort of pick a lane. There's no shortage of organizations to get active with. We need to, defend voting rights. We need to defend public education. We need to step up and say, this doesn't reflect my values. We need to, there's so many things that one can do.
But we've adopted a little saying at Vote Common Good in our work that in times like this, you don't do nothing.
You don't do nothing.
You do something.
That's
You come up with something. And that is really important, isn't it? That people,
It really is.
that people engage. And look, for some people, their engagement might be they're going to have one conversation. For someone else, they might run for office. For someone else, they might talk to their friend and convince them that what they're into is more than what they think. I've talked to a lot of people who are influenced by Christian nationalism. They don't often know it or recognize it. It's self-recognition is a very difficult thing for a lot of us. That's why we ask our friends if we have something in our teeth or if our breath smells funny. It's hard to know how that's going for us, and we need this response. Many of us feel like if Christian nationalism comes in our sphere, we just don't know what to do and how to respond.
I think it's also really important to help people understand that their vote really matters, not just in national elections, but also in local elections. I think a lot of people think, well, what does this have to do with me? Well, it has everything to do, frankly, with every aspect of your life. Your most fundamental rights, your right to vote, the right to form the families you want to form, your health care, your education, your right to a just workplace. I mean, this really affects foreign policy. I mean, this is just an enormously influential movement at every level, and it's always helpful. Look, I'm sure, we all have people in our circle, perhaps they're members of our families who think differently than we do. It's always useful to have those conversations and to try to find some common human ground and say, well, we'll think about this way, but without telling people they're wrong. Just try to introduce new ideas. But I think it's really important to engage people who feel disengaged and to help, look, 50% of Americans don't vote in national elections, and an additional number have their votes, the value of the votes diminished through gerrymandering and voter suppression tactics. So we really need to get people to understand that democracy is theirs if they can keep it.
Well, one of the pieces of advice that we give in our trainings on this is to engage with deep empathy. And one of the questions that empathy can ask you to consider is, what role does a person's belief play in their life? Not just what do they believe or why do they believe it, but how does it function? Do you have a sense of how Christian nationalism functions inside the lives of people who hold to it to such a degree that they will support it even when it has all this consequence? Like, what is it doing for people as best you can understand?
When you're talking about the rank and file, you're talking about a really wide range of people with different interests and identities and concerns and preoccupations. And for many of them, when they're casting their vote, say, to defend the family, or when they're casting their vote to, they've been told this is what religious freedom is, and they've been frightened, and this movement has a vast propaganda machine. They've been sort of told to vote because they should fear the other. A lot of times they're not making arguments about major changes in the way our government is run. They're really just kind of voting their identity. They're making a statement about values and what they value in themselves, right? But when we're looking at the leaders of the movement, they're after a much more, I would say, specific and tangible agenda. They want more power for themselves and their networks and their political allies. They're after money, both sources of private money and also, to a large degree, public money. They're going after a lot of public funding for their organizations. And of course, they're after policies that are going to privilege certain Americans and certain religious perspectives and are going to, underprivilege or not privilege other perspectives.
We only have a couple of minutes. Can we take a question or two from
Absolutely.
people here? Does anyone have a thought or a comment or a question you'd like to hear Katherine reflect on? Thank you. I see one there, and then there's one here. Okay, so that's two.
Yeah, there's a place called Charlotte Center for the Humanities, and they do a thing called the Festival of Ideas every year. And they had somebody that was sort of group that was trying to reinvigorate citizenship speak. It was 2 years ago. One of the points he made was that people that are voting as white Christian nationalists, the driving force is often that they feel irrelevant, and what they're voting towards is not so much something that they're trying to go towards, but something they're trying to get away from. And I'm curious how you have conversations with people that feel irrelevant and get them to disassociate their white Christian nationalist politics and their relevance.
Okay, that's a great question. We'll hold that one. We'll hear this question, and then we'll put the two together and respond to both of them.
Yes, actually, the question is right here on the screen.
Okay.
So
the question that's on the screen. How did you do that? You're like one of those magicians. It's like the card that you guys.
No, it was already there.
How can
we be
most effective in our opposition? Okay, so the question back here was: look, there's a lot of people might feel irrelevant, and what do we do? And how can we be most effective? And then, do you have a hand up for a question? Yep.
You said that people need to understand that vote is important. Kind of piggyback on this other question. I've done some polling with the group I'm with about voting, and the big problem was that people don't think it matters who wins.
Yeah.
It's not going to affect them. And so I'd like to know what you think. How do we educate them so that they know it does matter to them?
Great. Three wonderful questions. Any response you got?
I'm going to try to roll up three into one if I can. In part, the movement is intensified by we're really in a new Gilded Age. And I would say, a lot of the most devoted members of the rank and file, they're not the poor, right? They're people who are perhaps feeling like, as you said, maybe life is harder for them. I've heard many people say, my parents bought a house for, a perfectly nice house for $30,000, $40,000, and life was pretty sweet, and now I'm struggling to pay the bills and I'm feeling like, sidelined by the culture, and things are just much more difficult. I think it's very hard for people to understand that a lot of this feeling irrelevant is a consequence of decades of wealth concentration that actually leaves people. It's not the poor who are really supporting this the most. Frankly, it's anxious people. It's people who feel a loss of status anxiety. A lot of times it's white people who feel threatened by diversity, by racial diversity, and it's people who feel like it's like life has become more anxious because they feel like there's further to fall, and they could, like, what they have, they're holding on to it, whatever it is, with their, holding on to it as tight as they can, and they feel that they're going to have this kind of loss. And I think it really helps to drive home the fact that this is a movement that is promoting, look, maybe your parents could buy that house and not too much because wages were stronger, unions were stronger. The public schools were great because we were investing in public education at that time, and the religious right is actually, the Christian Nationalist movement has been trying to tear it down. They've really been trying, that's sort of a 75-year fight, but it's intensified in the last years.
Any ideas on how we can be more effective in our final minutes here?
I heard something in the last panel where a woman said this is a marathon and not a sprint. And I think of the words of David Barton, the great myth maker of the Christian nationalist movement, he said, arm yourself with the mentality of a distance runner and not a sprinter. And he's absolutely right about that. There's no quick fix. There are no guarantees, but there are many signs of hope. This is not our first rodeo with authoritarianism in this country. I think about some of the, in the war against slaveholding oligarchs, and the sort of efforts to deal with some of the grotesque wealth disparities and abuse of the American workforce in the early part of the 20th century. I think in the battle for the civil rights, women's rights movements. There are many times in America where we have actually fought injustices and however imperfectly have moved forward into the future. So I'm continue to take courage from some of those episodes.
Amen to that. I'm an long-time injured ultra distance runner, so we run more than 26-mile runs, 50 and 100-mile runs. And there's a beautiful African adage that a lot of people in that world like, and it's the saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And if we could, I'll just say in the political spaces that are opposed to Christian nationalism, many times it's difficult to stay together. There's a lot of pressures to find distinction between us that pulls us apart. And I feel like one of our ways to be most effective is to find some ways to be together in our way.
I agree with you. I just want to say, we need a big tent. This is, again, there are more of us than them. We're not all going to agree on everything. And that's normal and fine. You see this in a lot of families where you might have disagreements, but you're still a family and you're working towards some common goals. And at the religious right conferences I go to, they've started saying, because there are a lot of fissures in this movement, and that's topic for another conversation. There's a lot of, and they're starting to say, Ronald Reagan used to say, if somebody agrees with you 80% of the time, that's your 80% friend, not your 20% enemy. But it's a good lesson.
It's a good lesson. It's a good lesson, stopped clock theory. All right, hey, thanks a lot. Catherine's book is up there. You can find that. She'll be here for a bit. We have some curriculum on all this for churches and individuals and leaders and governments to be able to find their way.